There's so much going on in the global economy at the moment with Iran and US decline, China rise, et cetera, that it can be easy to miss the picture of what's happening to Europe, which has been historically a very big player and remains one, but it's a declining player. And while we have a lot of narratives and focus, rightly so, on what the US is doing as it's declining, there's less attention on what Europe is doing in the same situation. It's understandable why that might be the case. Europe has a lot more moving pieces and is more complex, and also hasn't been the dominant hegemon that the US has been post-World War II. But it is still a very significant player in world events, and it's worth paying attention to what's going on. Because as much as I like to say all the time that GDP doesn't matter and economy isn't everything and having money in your individual life isn't everything, there are obviously still real material factors in people's lives. And as there are radical shifts in those, they play out to radical shifts in other parts of people's lives. And just as you can sort of speculate and see that a changing face of US relative power in the world to China is leading them to shore up relative advantage and exert military power where previously they might not have, and pivot in certain domains of their global empire. So too is Europe changing, and for a number of reasons, not least being it's a patchwork of multiple different jurisdictions. I don't think it's doing a good job at all, and I think it's only going to continue its decline. And I think that could be a cool thing to look at today, not just for my European audience, but hopefully for everyone in the world, because I think it is an under-discussed story and is perhaps a worse one than it looks at first glance. So thank you so much if you're a patron of the show, so I can keep making things like this. I really appreciate your ongoing support, and I'm glad to have you. If you want to back me to do more of this, head on to patreon.com/Endry. But everyone, hope to see you on the other side of the music, and we'll get into what's going on with the decline of Europe. Welcome back to another cheery episode of the Chris Endry podcast. I think today's topic is one that I've been kind of skirting around for a while. If you're a patron, you'll have noticed that I've been pitching for a few years to talk about why I think Germany is in big trouble. But I think now it's sort of, the scales have tipped so far that it's worth talking about why all of Europe might be in trouble. And it's from the same basic phenomenon, which is a relative economic decline, uncertain present, even less certain future, and no real evidence that there are the correct tools to address the course and focus towards how to navigate the present to optimize the future. So annoyingly, I think to explain my position on all this stuff, I have to go back a little bit to post-World War II, where we all know that in liberating, quote unquote, Eastern Europe from the horrors of German militarism and occupation, the USSR occupied all of Eastern Europe and didn't leave. And we have a cultural conception of that because the regime eventually crumbled and those systems changed and were overthrown, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we don't have the same equivalent cultural conception of the US, and to a much, much lesser extent, Britain and France, having an occupying role in Western Europe all the way up to the Iron Curtain line post-World War II, to the degree that even today we still have dozens of US military bases in Germany and others across the continent that represent not just a benevolent umbrella to protect everybody in the world and to keep global peace. Yes, that's an element of it, but you'd be naive not to also have seen the actions of intelligence agencies of America and the role of their military force and political power, et cetera, to steer the political systems and political figures and economic outcomes of all of Europe to be very friendly to American interests as well. To a degree that does get quite shocking if you look into it. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of that today, but if you to look at Operation Gladio or some other examples of US interventions in European politics, it is much less a benevolent force than most of us live our day-to-day lives thinking. In any case, all of this is just to say that the state that we have now, where we have this patchwork of European states held together by a European Union, there's an odd dance between local sovereignty, democratic legitimacy, raw power politics, and I guess kind of colonial subjugation even, that sees Europe making its decisions through a horrible sausage maker that leads to horrible sausages. I'm sorry for that terrible imagery, but that is kind of the case of it. And I think that's never been clearer than in the events following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we've seen kind of total fall in lockstep initially of European politics and military resources behind US policy, which has obviously diverged significantly since Trump's been elected, but that's another topic, in ways that have been in some instances not in European interests. And even the very concept of European interest is a murky one that I think is too smoothly used, because obviously the strategic interests of Estonia are radically different to the strategic interests of Portugal, which are radically different to the strategic interests of Croatia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they do get blanketed together a lot, which I think is the type of stuff that plants the seeds that the more you do unify around these things, the more inevitable it is that they will break apart. But I'm jumping around a bit. So why it's my contention that what is occurring between Russia and Ukraine is not in Europe's interest is almost embarrassing to have to say out loud, because I think it should be so obvious, but I also at the same time think that it's undersaid. Because if you look at it in black and white terms, like kids looking at a risk board, you might think, oh, well, Russia's moving this way. That's really bad. It's in Europe's interest to push back. Yes, true if that's all the assumptions that you have about reality. But of course, reality is always more dynamic and complex. And the reality is there are some 6 nations or whatever of Europe that border Ukraine, and it is in none of their interests to have a state that is heavily militarized, collapsing, full of traumatized people and flooded with weapons and deeply corrupt and poor. It's not in anybody's interest to have a conflict continuing in that space, but Europe collectively has put in effectively zero efforts to negotiate a peace or to work between those parties to find a peace since the start of that conflict. And that is largely at the behest initially of the US, and now the EU has taken the mantle of that. And the reasons for that occurring are also are complex and beyond my capacity to predict at a distance, or in anybody's potentially, because they will be a confluence of interests. But that the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, which it looks like were at very least US endorsed, if not US enacted, as Seymour Hersh has contended. That type of moment, if you're not familiar, there's a pipeline between Russia and Germany that was built to supply gas, spent 10 billion plus euros on it, and then it exploded early on in the Russia-Ukraine war and effectively severed Europe from dependence on Russian gas, at least the major economy, which is Germany, obviously. And that an event like that could occur without significant pushback, or indeed actually any pushback from the Western European countries, especially Germany, whose infrastructure that they owned was exploded, is a betrayal of reality moment, those lightning moments I always like to talk about, where you can see, oh, right, this is a state that's fully, in critical matters like this, when push comes to shove, they are completely owned, I guess, by US interests, because it's obviously not in the interest of the Germans to pay a lot more for gas. I mean, they can make those choices themselves, but this instance was not that. This was the explosion of infrastructure. And not only that, they'd invested their own money in that infrastructure, and there were no consequences for the destruction of it. Even still today, all these years later, all of their inquiries have been pretty milquetoast, and there's 15 different implausible narratives that seem to be continuously leaked about who it was that did it, including a ragtag group who hired a yacht to explode some big infrastructure without leaving a trace. I mean, it's comedic stuff. But gets to the point the initial point that I'm making, which is Europe is in trouble because it is unable to exercise its own organic interests. And that's kind of fine when times are good, but the threats that Europe faces now are becoming much larger, particularly with the Iran war and the ongoing failure to wrap up the Russia-Ukraine war. And kind of going along with whatever the Americans want or is in American interests is starting to have, I would say, consequences that are bigger than just a little sting in the economy here or a wound to the pride there. They're going to start to be almost existential conflicts. And I'm wary of saying that stuff because I don't like to come across as too Cassandra-esque in my assessment of these things. But I really do think that the fundamental settings for things like Europe's ability to have a functioning economy, to have manufacturing, to have energy, to have democracy, to have strategic autonomy, and to have security, the sort of cluster knot of threats to all of those at once is the type of thing that has me very, very skeptical that projects like the EU will be able to survive another decade. And so, radical claims need radical evidence, etc. I owe it to you, the listener, to go into it a bit rather than just throw out my assertions. But I will also say that this is not an essay for a think tank. These are my thoughts. I am happy to present them as such if somebody is providing the format for me to publish them. But in the podcast format, so I can move freely, I'm not going to be constantly diving into statistics and things like that. But yes, as I said, I am very happy to dig them up and to have this conversation at a more formal level if required. Anyway, dreaming big. So on to the radical evidence. So I've long said that the problem with the Iran war is bigger than it initially seemed, and that's been borne out by its continuance to today. And no immediate or obvious path to how that's going to end in sight. And one of the risks to Europe in this is that Europe has no capacity to end that conflict, but it has every interest in it ending that the Americans do not share. And the problems are not just military ones, obviously. They come from this sort of bubble in the pipeline where our entire international economy is underpinned by one critical resource, oil, and radical shifts to the supply of that has consequences that will be scaffolded and escalating, and will also come with different consequences that you can't predict in advance at different rates. It's extra dire for Europe because Europe doesn't have its own access to these resources, whereas the US, the other participant in that conflict, they have, thanks to their exploitation of shale oil, they're a net energy exporters now, despite using such massive amounts themselves. So do the Americans want the cost of their energy to go up? No, but it's not an existential threat for them that it does. They're pretty well positioned. They're better positioned than many of their rivals for that eventuality, whereas Europe is appallingly positioned without any access to stuff, and making it worse because of the opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They've made Russian resources strictly verboten and almost cut off from that entirely, at least publicly. So it's making the fundamental underpinning elements of the entire economy more expensive. And I guess because the EU is so big and has so many people, and many of those people are so rich, there's a conception that it is a powerful mover in the world. But if you look at the data, it's pretty alarming for Europe, I think. And again, I don't want to go into data too much because you can lie and hide stuff in these things. But the EU's share of the global economy was around 29% in the 70s and 80s, and even in the early 90s. And since then, there's been a continuous decline. And it's around 15% today. So it's a significant one. And you might think, well, okay, there's a relative decline. Well, there's been big growth in China. But the US has, whilst it's had a decline, it's much small. It's a few percentage points or something like that. It's gone from like 25 to 21 or something. Again, don't quote me, I saved for the paper. And those numbers are one thing, but more concerning is that it's very obvious that the growth that we've seen in our world has been the huge technological boom we've had in the last couple of decades, particularly with digital and tech companies. And it's very hard to think of where the future of those is in Europe. Almost all of the major tech companies are American or Chinese, depending on which market's using them. But where's Europe's Google or Microsoft or whatever? I mean, there are smaller players like Spotify, but they hardly compare to Apple or Nvidia or. So I just go down the top 10 European companies by market capitalization. We've got ASML Holding, which is superconductors in the Netherlands, LVMH, Moët Hennessy, Louis Vuitton, SAP, which is accounting software, AstraZeneca, obviously pharmaceuticals, HSBC, banking, Nestle, Roche Holding, which is pharmaceuticals, Novo Nordisk, which is Ozempic, Shell, and Novartis. So a reasonable suite of companies. Their total market cap is around $2.5 trillion for the top 10. Looking globally, number one on its own, 4.6 trillion. So almost double. That's just NVIDIA on its own. Then you've got Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Broadcom, Taiwan Semiconductor, a great name, Saudi Arabia Oil Company, and Tesla. All those companies are far more influential in our day-to-day lives. So it's not just a financial one. I mean, never mind the fact that their market capitalization is like 10 times those of the European ones. They're also, it's not just a financial issue. They're also the big companies that shape our reality and our future. I mean, it's hard to see how Nestle is going to radically change what it does in the next few years to grow massively, but Alphabet, Amazon, whatever. I mean, they've all grown massively and recently. So they also represent a sovereignty strategic risk, which is worth looking at because, and I've talked about this in other episodes, but as the AI technologies and sort of tech panopticon that we've already lowered on us lowers further and clicks into place, it's a real problem not to have European fingerprints on how that stuff is done, given it will define so much of our society and so easily can influence what occurs in our societies. And so it's easy to see how that financial gap is only going to continue to grow, just looking at those companies. But also imagining the capacity of new European companies is tough given the fundamentals are bad. There's population decline, wages are higher than most of the world. And most critically, I guess, perhaps, is that energy is more and more expensive. And this is not just because of what's happened in the Middle East lately, but also the result of the divorce from Russian energy that occurred following the Ukraine war, which is understandable. It's understandable that there'd be a moral response to that situation. But Europe has kind of responded by kind of trying to morally bully Russia into ending the war. Not only has that not worked, but it's made the energy that's here, because Russia gas and oil used to be the biggest supplier, much more expensive. And that has real consequences for economies, particularly manufacturing-based ones like Germany, where you have some of their biggest players like BASF, the chemical manufacturer. They've upped stumps and moved offshore. They've moved to China. And, they've been manufacturing chemicals in Germany for 100 years. And they're not coming back. And that's just one example of many companies that have made that decision. And it's also hard to see how, you're already in a situation where if you look at what Chinese car manufacturing has done in the last 10 years, where it's gone from offering an inferior product to one at least on par or in many ways superior, particularly in electrical cars. Do we think that that's going to change anytime soon, and that Mercedes and Volkswagen and Renault and Peugeot and whatever are all going to regain shares in that market by having higher fundamental input costs, not just with labor, but with also energy for manufacturing, and also less wieldy logistics chains and distribution networks and tech manufacturing centers, et cetera, and not to mention the regulation, but that's outside of our pay grade for today. It's very easy to see these things in Germany in particular, but across Europe, coming to a bit of a collapse, and they don't collapse lightly. Like when you think of the monoliths that exist in your time that it will be around forever, they never are. And when they go suddenly and don't come back. So it's very easy to see a world in which Volkswagen cars suddenly are many times more expensive than Chinese ones to produce and therefore to purchase. And the quality is not only about the same, but inferior. And then suddenly, why would you buy it? That happened to Australian car manufacturing. They're not making Commodores or Falcons anymore, and they'll probably never make them again. There's no need for inferior cars that cost more to make. And you can say the same for anything. If you pick up any consumer goods, if you visit your parents' house, for example, and look at the consumer goods that are sitting in a garage, there'll be things that were made in West Germany. There'll be things that were made in America or made in the UK or whatever. And it's kind of astonishing now to think that these places were making little small plastic toys or whatever because it is just so much cheaper to make them in China now. And you can see that across kind of everything. Whereas Europe needs these things, these industries to keep their economies running. And so I thought in research for this that I would look at what the leadership of Europe is saying, because this is another problem. I don't feel like the perspectives of people are filtered up and connected where there's a leadership that's accountable to what people think, or at least what their interests are, or democratic mechanisms for altering that. And I think that across the board generally in the world. So it's not a uniquely European problem, but because Europe does have a patchwork of different nations with different interests that are connected, it is perhaps a little more incumbent upon them to do a better job of being able to represent that so that they are more robust in dealing with the problems that they face. So I had a look. Turns out there was a foreign ministers gathering in Brussels this week, and on the agenda, this is from Kaja Kallas, who is the Vice President of the European Commission and responsible for speaking on foreign policy. On today's agenda, what do you think the number one item is? You're wrong. It's the Western Balkans, strengthening our partners' resilience. So presumably that's something in kind of Russia-proofing them or something like that, and keeping them strung along, particularly with Serbia, where they want to, have influence over the region. Number two, Russia's war against Ukraine, including new sanctions. Yeah, I've said a lot about that. But not surprising that I would be talking about it, but surprising that they are still trying to convince us that they're going to sanction their way out of it. Number three, the Middle East with a focus on freedom of navigation and sanctions against violent settlers. So that violent settlers, that must be, the lowest hanging fruit or the minimum passable thing that they're able to get away with in criticizing Israel in its expansionist wars, and focus on freedom of navigation. Well, that's something that's out of their control. That's going to be a matter to negotiate entirely, but is with bigger consequences for the EU than the US has discussed. EU-Canada relations, who cares? Nice to have. Syria, including the first ever high-level political dialogue. Just a side note, that is really funny because the president of Syria was, I've talked about before, on a $10 million US hit list bounty because of his crimes as a ISIS-adjacent member of Al-Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not sure exactly what it is that happens in the world, but he, got put into a suit, and now he's meeting with King Charles and having a high-level dialogue with the European Union. It's remarkable what happens in this world. I don't I don't know the details of it, but I can't think positively of them knowing just that information. But in any case, none of those things are what I think would be the most important things. If I were the foreign minister, and there's many good reasons that I'm not, I would number one item on my agenda would be, how can we do everything we can to end the war that is occurring on our doorstep? There are 1 million plus people that have died in that, and tens of millions of lives that are shattered. That can't go on. Never mind just the moral considerations. Also, Russia is our neighbor forever. We're going to need to figure out a way to deal with that. That's positive and mutually reinforcing our security and wealth, not mutually degrading it. Okay, maybe I'm living in a bit of a fantasy land to think that could happen, but that would still be on my list. And the second thing I would be looking at is the critical loss of sovereignty that we face in an uncertain world with, in particular, US corporate tech dominance, where we are not in control of our own societies anymore or the mechanisms that drive them, and the catastrophic resource situation where we have to deal with it because our entire economies are going to go down the gurgler in a way that ends historically in a very ugly fashion that we want to avoid as much as possible. But also, these are problems that only we are going to advocate for, because our relative decline to China, Russia, and the US is not something that's going to bother them in the slightest. And it's our responsibility to care about that if anybody's going to. But, that stuff, for whatever reason, doesn't appear on the list. And I alluded at the top about the sort of US ownership of a lot of European sovereignty as being a part of that. Another part of it is, just in any alliance, which is what Europe is, you get a committee style decision-making where you're not best representing everyone's interests inevitably. I really apologize for being doomy on it, but I just can't see the political structures that make up Europe as it is currently surviving with these underpinning problems and an inability to move on them. And annoyingly, you really only see representations of these issues, sovereignty, energy, peace. You really only see them represented in the fringe far right at the moment. And it's wrong now to call it a fringe far right. They are dominant political movements, with the AfD in Germany and the RN in France. They look like they might win the presidency next year. And that backswing is an inevitable consequence of not including in the center sphere things that are part of people's legitimate interests and finding ways to incorporate them in how you structure your society. And there really hasn't been a dialogue on many of these issues. And what's more, the dialogue is actively shut down in many spheres, which is another topic, but not one for today. And when you add into the mix the kind of wicked problem of needing to grow the population to stave off economic collapse, because you have to pay more for older people, and who's going to pay the tax to do that, who's going to generate the wealth to do that, in a situation where across basically all of Europe, I think there are only one or two countries that have populations that are even at replacement level, you're suddenly entering a social and political environment where there is maybe an all-time low appetite for immigration to address that. Who can predict what ugliness could come from any of this in any direction? And much as with the energy in the Middle East being a bubble situation, in that there's a bubble in the pipeline, we're used to having this amount of energy in the world, but now it's good, but that's going to decrease. There's the green shoots of the pivot to the far right across all of Europe and the demographic problems. They're also only just beginning to emerge relative to where they can go and probably will go. And so too the economic problems. And this is something that is an inevitable consequence of having short-term focused political systems across the planet. You see the same thing. I mean, for example, now in Sweden, you see as of the 1st of January this year, the government will pay families 90,000 Australian dollars to remigrate. This is centrist government. That would have been a radical policy a few years ago, and that gives an indication of what the appetite is already for large numbers of migrants, because you're not dealing with the same type of societies as Australia and Canada and the US, which are kind of ideologically underpinned on a multicultural vision or sort of a values-based one rather than an ethnic national one. And you've seen in Europe, across two horrific world wars, a sort of redefinition of the places that people are afforded across these collective cultural and ethnic and identity lines that are, I guess, less robust in the face of millions of people from other cultures coming in and to be integrated. And so that's the thorny issue that's hard to see how that resolves. And the economic one is also one that I fear is being masked a bit because of the enthusiastic participation now. in the Russia-Ukraine war. I say enthusiastic participation, not in terms of sending soldiers and things like that, but it's hard to point at a line between European leadership behavior and the outcome of ending that war. There's certainly lots of lines of punish Russia, to support Ukraine, to continue fighting the war, assert our position on what's right and what's wrong, but very little on what will actually end the war. And it's a shifting baseline in that at the start of the war, Germany drew its red lines. We're absolutely not getting involved in sending any weapons. Now they've sent whole arsenals across, and furthermore, they've borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars to increase the spending of their own military and to mask the problem of the more expensive energy, which is not a permanent solution, but the problem is increasingly permanent. And it's an ugly thing to see because it's socially something that's easy to get away with. It's kind of like akin to if you said, can you cook me a nice meal? And I said, yeah, sure thing. And I went to the shops and I spent $1 billion and came home and said, I spent $1 billion on nice food. Like, oh, where's my meal? I spent $1 billion on the food, because what's happening is there's no goal that is to do anything that would definitively end the war between Russia and Ukraine by militarily supporting Ukraine. There's enough weapons and drones to continue them fighting the war, but that money is unsurprisingly, firstly through the US and now through Europe, filtered through domestic weapons manufacturers. So it keeps the economy ticking along. And weapons are, the perfect capitalist product in one sense, because they're increasingly expensive to manufacture because of complex moving parts. And once they're exploded, you need to replace them immediately. So there's a constant demand. And so while the war's going, that's good. And you kind of mask all that stuff. And the EU is kind of all in a sense, on the continuation of that stuff occurring by doing generational borrowing. I mean, Germany alone took the handbrake, the historical debt handbrake. They parliamentarily removed, they weren't allowed to go past a certain percent of debt to GDP ratio with their borrowing. They removed that so they could keep borrowing in this present circumstances. And it's all well and good while you're filtering the money through Rheinmetall and doing manufacturing, but it puts you in a bad situation, because flooding the continent with complex weapons kind of puts you in two situations. One, if you stop producing them, the backbone, a significant portion of your economy dries up and that puts you in trouble. Or two, we've got all these weapons lying around. Let's use them to achieve some of our political outcomes that we're not getting otherwise. And there are plenty of active theaters in which one can choose to get involved at the moment, even perfectly legitimately. It's always the case. And I guess as much as if you look at the interwar years or pre-World War I, there's any sort of number of flashpoints where things could have occurred, that the underlying conditions provided for an escalation of war. And it feels very much the same way now. But even if in the absence of that, even just the sort of mildly shitty consequences of failing economies and worried people and unhappy societies and whatever, they're concerning enough. They're bad enough outcomes, given how great reality is and how cool things can be and how worth investing in a positive vision of the present and future are. Yeah, so there's some of the key reasons why I'm concerned about the direction that Europe is going, and I only bring them to you because I think they may be under-discussed. I'm super happy to be wrong about everything. I know that my opinions are not ones that generally line up with most people, so very keen to hear what you think about this situation. Jump into the comments and tell me why I'm wrong. Give me your own vision and correct me on any of the big things, or there's inevitably things I'm missing. But at the same time, if you are a think tank in need of a piece, I've got a lot to write on all of these topics, and I'll even cite my sources. Regardless, though, thank you so much for sticking with me to the end of this, and I appreciate you having you along. If you like me doing this stuff, please head on over to patreon.com/Endrey, ENDREY. There is a free tier that you can join and have some involvement. But of course, if you sign up and pay, you get to be involved in more stuff, including some stuff I'm going to do on Eurovision this week. That's its own wormhole. I'll be talking about the politics, but of course, even at some point, I'll have to get around to the music. Can you imagine? It's always a pleasure having you to listen, and I really appreciate it. I hope that you're doing well out there. And despite everything I've said, my life has nothing to do with these grand machinations. Whilst I think it's worth caring about the civilizational level, because, it's a great duty and responsibility, broadly, my life is great. And I would love to hear from you on what your thoughts are. All right, take it easy out there. Bye.